Suicide of the West. An essay on the meaning and destiny of liberalism. James Burnham. Chapter 6, Ideological Thinking.
The preceding 3 chapters have put before us, lighted and focused under an analytic microscope, the ideology of liberalism exhibited as a set of 19 primary ideas and beliefs, 22, if we include the 3 corollaries. Just as in the case of the 39 sentences listed in Chapter 2, I think most Americans and Europeans will find that they agree with all or almost all of the 19, or disagree with many or most of them. That is to say, Americans and Europeans are either infected with the liberal ideology and therefore manifest many of the symptoms of the liberal syndrome, or they are not and don't. To liberals, many of these 19 ideas are likely to seem so obviously true that they have never bothered to put them into words, too obvious for fruitful discussion, not so much the private chattels of liberalism as the common ideas that all enlightened, educated, rational and decent men of the present age share, to the exclusion only of archaic types like U.S. senators from the Deep South, along with extremists, fascists and crackpots. To most liberals, these ideas and beliefs do not seem to require proof or even careful examination, and in fact they have seldom been submitted to careful and systematic examination. They are not part of the content but of the form of current discussion, of Mr. Hutchins' universal dialogue. Rational discussion of moot problems tends to assume them as a framework. This is perfectly illustrated by an official memorandum that was issued to the teachers and pupils of the Washington, D.C., school system late in 1962 in connection with an anti-Nazi, anti-racist project. The pupils, 85% of whom were Negroes, were to read accounts of the Nazi massacres of Jews and then tell in class their own experiences with racial discrimination.
In a democracy,
the memorandum explained,
everyone has the right to his own convictions and attitudes toward others, but all attitudes and convictions must be based on truth and reason.
Attitudes and convictions based on truth and reason are those, it is needless to add, that are consistent with the liberal ideology. When we discover that certain ideas about man, history, and society seem, to those who believe in them, to be either self-evident or so manifestly correct that opposing them is a mark of stupidity or malice, then we may be fairly sure we are dealing with an ideology in ideological thinking. The fact that most liberals, though prepared to debate about concrete application and specific program, feel that sort of certainty about the basic ideas of liberalism is a strong indication of what is indeed the case, that liberalism is an ideology. Before continuing with the analysis of the content of liberalism, let us examine somewhat more closely the nature of ideologies and ideological thinking. A convinced believer in the anti-Semitic ideology tells me that the Bolshevik Revolution is a Jewish plot. I point out to him that the revolution was led to its first major victory by a non-Jew, Lenin. He then explains that Lenin was the pawn of Trotsky, Radek, Kamenev, Zinoviev and other Jews who were in the Bolshevik high command. I remind him that Lenin's successor as leader of the revolution, the non-Jew Stalin, killed off all those Jews, and that Stalin has been followed by the non-Jew Khrushchev, under whose rule there have been notable revivals of anti-Semitic attitudes and conduct. He then informs me that the seeming Soviet anti-Semitism is only a fraud invented by the Jewish press, and that Stalin and Khrushchev are really Jews whose names have been changed, with a total substitution of forged records. Suppose I am able to present documents that even he will have to admit show this to be impossible. He is still unmoved. He tells me that the real Jewish center that controls the revolution and the entire world conspiracy is not in Russia anyway, but in Antwerp, Tel Aviv, Lhasa, New York or somewhere, and that it has deliberately eliminated the Jews from the public officialdom of the Bolshevik countries in order to conceal its hand and deceive the world about what is going on. QED. A believer in dialectical materialism, the communist ideology, states that the Communist Party represents the interests of the proletariat, that is, of the workers. I show that in this, that and the other country, most of the workers do not support the Communist Party, even where a democratic political order would permit them to do so without hindrance. He explains that the opinions of the workers have been corrupted by capitalist social conditions and pro-capitalist indoctrination. I note, with adequate documentation, that in countries run by the Communist Party the workers are worse off and have still less influence on the government than in many non-communist countries. He tells me that this reflects the survival of capitalist remnants, the backwardness of the economy taken over from capitalism and the hostile pressure of the surrounding imperialist environment, and that, in any case, what the Communist Party represents is not the present consciousness of the workers, blinded by ignorance and illusion, but their objective historical interest. QED. A liberal informs me that the races of mankind do not differ in intellectual or moral capacity, in civilization building, talent, or in any other attribute fitting them to exercise full and equal political rights. I mention that most scholars in the field, whatever their philosophical views, seem to agree that at any rate the Australian Bushmen and African Pygmies are somewhat defective in these respects, however admirable in others. These two instances he dismisses as no more than living fossils, evolutionary accidents that have no practical significance. I recall studies proving that the various races show considerable differences, not traceable to social environment, in susceptibility to certain diseases, in physiological reactions and physical measurements, etc. He answers, even when, as is not seldom the case, his theoretical philosophy commits him to a view that denies the independent reality of mind, that these physical differences have no bearing on the question of mental differences. I point out to him that Negroes in the United States have not attained levels of intellectual eminence in as high a proportion to their numbers as have whites. He explains that this is obviously due to their lack of equal education. I restrict the comparison to the members of the two races who have received the same amount of schooling. He says the schooling provided for Negroes is inferior in facilities and quality to that provided for whites, even when equal in amount. I accept the further restriction, and still note a disparity in attainments. He then explains that there cannot be equality in racially separate schools no matter if they are equal in all other respects, because the separateness itself causes traumatic disturbances that have a negative effect on the educative process. I offer the comparative records of graduates of schools in which the two races sit together. He assimilates these by pointing to the less favorable economic, social and cultural condition of the Negro sample outside of school. I ask about the results of tests that have been alleged to rate intellectual abilities independently of environment and education. When these are found to rate Negroes at levels substantially below whites of the same age, he concludes that the tests do not really do what is claimed, that they have been devised in a white-controlled culture and reflect not innate but in part acquired traits unconsciously introduced. And so on. QED. The militant segregationist will have equivalent answers, in reverse, to all possible queries. I mention, after hearing him assert the innate inferiority of the Negro race, the fact that in baseball, boxing, track and field sports, Negroes are the champions. These purely physical achievements, he explains, are proof how close Negroes remain to animals in the evolutionary scale. I add the names of Negro musicians, singers, actors and writers of the first rank. Naturally, he comments, they carry over a sense of rhythm from the tribal dance and tom-tom ceremonies. I ask how many law graduates of his state university could stand up against Judge Thurgood Marshall, how many sociologists, against Professor C. Eric Lincoln, how many psychologists, against Professor Kenneth Clark. Doubtless all such have plenty of white blood, he answers, but in any case they are only exceptions to prove the general rule of inferiority, that is confirmed by the low intellectual attainments of the average Negro. I observe that the average Negro has been educated in worse schools, and for fewer years, than the average white. Of course, he agrees, no use wasting good education on low-grade material. QED. An ideologue, one who thinks ideologically, can't lose. He can't lose because his answer, his interpretation and his attitude have been determined in advance of the particular experience or observation. They are derived from the ideology, and are not subject to the facts. There is no possible argument, observation or experiment that could disprove a firm ideological belief for the very simple reason that an ideologue will not accept any argument, observation or experiment as constituting disproof. This we saw candidly proclaimed in Mr. Hutchins' speech.
One advantage of this faith.
In liberalism.
is that it is practically
There is no reason for even that modest qualification.
shockproof.
An ideology is a more or less systematic and self-contained set of ideas supposedly dealing with the nature of reality, usually social reality, or some segment of reality, and of man's relation, attitude, conduct, toward it, and calling for a commitment independent of specific experience or events. In some instances, among which dialectical materialism is currently conspicuous, the commitment is total and the system both rigorous and inclusive. Liberalism, for most of its adherents, is looser in logic, more limited in range, and less wholly demanding in its spiritual claim. But it shares with dialectical materialism and many another modern doctrine the distinctive traits of an ideology, which Professor Oakeshott describes as follows.
As I understand it, a political ideology purports to be an abstract principle, or set of related abstract principles, which has been independently premeditated. It supplies in advance of the activity of attending to the arrangements of a society a formulated end to be pursued, and in so doing it provides a means of distinguishing between those desires which ought to be encouraged and those which ought to be suppressed or redirected. The simplest sort of political ideology is a single abstract idea, such as freedom, equality, maximum productivity, racial purity, or happiness. And in that case political activity is understood as the enterprise of seeing that the arrangements of a society conform to or reflect the chosen abstract idea. It is usual, however, to recognize the need for a complex scheme of related ideas, rather than a single idea, as in such systems of ideas as the Principles of 1789, Liberalism, Democracy, Marxism, or the Atlantic Charter. These principles need not be considered absolute or immune from change, though they are frequently so considered, but their value lies in their having been premeditated. A political ideology purports to supply in advance knowledge of what freedom, or democracy, or justice is.
The liberal opposition to seniority and similar rules in the legislature is a typical example of ideological thinking. This opposition is derived from, or perhaps, more exactly, justified by, certain principles, from, specifically, the abstract doctrine of popular sovereignty in democracy as this is developed in the liberal ideology. The liberals are certainly correct in finding that the seniority rules are inconsistent with their abstract doctrine. But to accept that finding as conclusive and as dictating the abolition of the seniority rules, we must assume not only that our particular doctrine, liberalism, is true, but also that abstract reasoning takes precedence over practical experience. Practical experience undoubtedly supports the seniority rules. In fact, the rules are merely the formalization of long practical experience. Let us consider varied additional examples, some rather more sophisticated than those already given, of ideological thinking based on liberal doctrine. 1. Some years ago liberals concerned with social reform and urban renewal, as it has come to be called, turned their attention to Skid Row. In accord with the canons of ideological thinking, Skid Row was understood as a problem, and, since it was a problem, liberals had a duty to solve it. During the past decade they have attempted a direct and, it would seem, sufficiently drastic solution, in a number of American cities, including some of the largest, New York, Boston, St. Louis, San Francisco. They have been simply destroying the local embodiments of Skid Row and replacing these with boulevards, parks, garden apartments, new shopping areas, etc. But what exactly is Skid Row? In reality it is not, other than incidentally, a spatial concept at all, but a functional concept, and not so much a special problem as merely a natural, indeed inevitable, condition of every articulated community of any size, except perhaps for some artificial communities like zoned bedroom suburbs or carefully controlled company towns, and even these are not usually exceptions for long. Skid Row is the end of the line, and there must be an end of the line somewhere. It is the state of those individuals who by destiny or choice drop out of normal society, even out of criminal society, which is after all part of the normal order of things. Most of these individuals are alcoholics and some are drug addicts. Where they are is Skid Row, and Skid Row exists in every city, and always has. In the natural course of events, when the process is not interfered with by ideologues relentlessly determined to solve problems, the citizens of Skid Row usually gather together in one particular district of each town and city. In New York it was the Bowery, as everyone knew, the most famous of America's skid rows. That district is always frightfully run down. It has cheap bars selling rotten liquor, and cheap stores selling even rottener liquor substitutes, flophouses offering flea-bitten cots for a few cents a night, greasy hamburger joints, vacant lots where bonfires can be made of old boards and packing boxes, a 10th-rate pawn shop or two, sagging doorways where the cops won't bother a man while he sleeps off his drunk, a commercial blood bank where you can sell a pint of blood every month or so if you don't have an active disease, a dreary Catholic church and 2 or 3 evangelical chapels in old loft buildings, a Salvation Army station where you can get some soup or stew in exchange for singing a hymn, a city-run flophouse where you can have, when the mood strikes you now and then, a delousing and shower along with a plate of food and a bed for the night. This district is where the skid rowers stay when they are in town, and where they head for when they arrive, since every certified skid rower is equipped with a built-in homing compass. To the respectable citizen Skid Row seems a macabre place, but in its own way Skid Row is an ingenious product of the long and wonderfully intricate natural evolution of the city. In society as it really is, hierarchical and differentiating, not equalized or regimented, there has to be an end of the line. The localization of Skid Row and the growth of its distinctive institutions and customs are gradual developments serving to take care of those at the end of the line in a way that recognizes the reality of the condition, makes appropriate exceptions to the usual social rules, adds a certain warmth and humaneness along with exits left open for those, they are not many, who wish to take one, and shields the rest of society from Skid Row's potentially destructive effects. But this cannot be the way liberalism understands Skid Row. For liberalism, Skid Row is not a natural and inevitable social condition but a definite place, the Bowery, the Embarcadero, South State Street, wherever, that constitutes, as I began by noting, a problem, blighted area. The people in it are, they must be, by the principles of liberalism, the exploited victims of the area's blight, of inadequate education and bad institutions. Therefore the area must be renewed and the victims reformed. This is the reasoning that has produced the recent movement to abolish Skid Row, as a result of which New York's Bowery and a number of its equivalents in other cities have in fact been in varying degrees cleaned up. The law clamped down on the flophouses, bars and sleeping drunks. They were always illegal, of course, but before the renewers struck, the cops, knowing the condition with which they were dealing, looked the other way. The rotted buildings were bulldozed aside, and the exiled inhabitants invited to the joys of rehabilitation. The whole operation has proved to be, inevitably, an ideological illusion. Since Skid Row is not in reality a static thing or a place, it cannot be abolished or rubbed out. The most noticeable consequence of this anti-Skid Row campaign has merely been to diffuse Skid Row, for a while, throughout the city. The displaced alcoholics, hobos and junkies, who had their own localized and more or less self-sufficient society along the Bowery or South State Street, have been lurching all over New York, Chicago, Boston and St. Louis, trying to catch money for drinks or dope, knocking into the respectable citizens, making scenes in decent bars, and in general acting, with more than a little justification, like resentful aliens. But of course the liberal reformers can drive you through the old locales and show you triumphantly that Skid Row has vanished. There are not a few who hope that it will be refounded, and it will be. 2. A second homely example, I often walk back from work, when I am working in New York, along some blocks where there are many small grocery and fruit stores. One afternoon I stopped to look rather idly at a truck I had noticed before in the neighborhood. It was such a piece of tied-together junk that one wondered how it kept going, but it managed to. It was operated by 2 Negroes. They were pulled up at one of the stores, and were carrying out big piles of old paperboard boxes. After folding each box flat, a considerable job, as those know who have tried it, they would tie a score of them together and pack the bundle in their wobbly truck. The 2 Negroes were cheerful, pleasant fellows. They worked amicably together. I got to know them a little that day and thereafter, and it was plain that they had IQs down almost out of sight, but they could handle the work they were doing, and they took pride in doing it well. One reason I became interested in this little vignette of city life at that time was because just then the mayor, Robert Wagner, a leading liberal politician, backed by all liberal opinion in the city, was demanding that the state government lift the minimum wage floor to $1.50 or $2 or $1.75 or whatever it was an hour. And what struck me as I watched my two friends, and what I verified by a little inquiry, was that a rise in minimum wage, if enforced, would most certainly throw those two chaps out of their jobs. The truck was owned by some dim exploiter in the background. He made the deals with the little shops, and with whatever mysterious party wanted those bundles of discarded boxes, and the whole operation could be carried on only because he could get these two men at a small wage, which by chiseling he made even smaller. A terrible thing, no doubt, such sordid exploitation, and no one, or hardly anyone, it would seem, could live in our affluent society on so little money as those wages provided. Yet here these two were, working hard, liking their job, which was, to tell the truth, as much of a challenge as they could have met successfully, proud to be self-reliant, standing on their own feet. And with their wives going out some as part-time maids and the older children running a few policy tickets, they and their families managed to eat and to keep the households going. When the mayor gets his new minimum wage, he failed that round, but he, or the next mayor, will surely return. Those boxes will be thrown into one of the big grinder trucks for dumping at sea. My friends will go on relief and soon, quite probably, become bums and delinquents, but an ideological abstraction will have been satisfied. 3. Another item, much too small to be noticed in a world dominated by glittering abstractions and their dark opposites. My wife and I, our children being no longer at home, live in a rather primitive area of the northwest Connecticut hills, and we have a large police dog who is very unfriendly, as he is supposed to be, to nearly everyone except members of our family. Because we are often away and he too big to take traveling, we must leave him periodically at a kennel, and this has been a difficulty, because he does not like to leave us, or to go to kennels, and he does not like most kennel owners. Moreover, many kennels out in the country are not clean and pleasant enough, we think, for this dog. But we found one, a while ago, that is perfect for all parties concerned. It is run for police dogs only by a family of German origin. The husband, as Germans often do, teaches minor musical instruments, and the kennel is run as an auxiliary operation. The kennel, or kennels, are well built, very clean and very well taken care of. They and the dogs are handled, physically speaking, by a serf named Ralph. That seems to be his only name. Ralph has no fixed hours and no days off. His master would never think of leading a newly arrived dog up the 100 feet to the kennel. He summons Ralph in the German manner, without saying please, even when Ralph is in the middle of supper or sleep. But Ralph never complains and is indeed an exceptionally cheerful man. He seems content to live at the same intellectual level as the police dogs, and he and the dogs, including our normally unfriendly dog, love each other. Ralph cannot say much, or does not, thank you, when you give him a pair of gloves for Christmas, or hello, or a word about how well your dog ate, but he smiles well. And he is proud, too, and his spick-and-span half-acre, with the decorations he has carved to go with his trim kennels, prove he has a right to his pride. There are no minimum wages yet in the hills of northwestern Connecticut, or even unions. So for a while longer Ralph can stay out of an institution and continue his busy medieval role of man to master. But the ideologists will probably get him soon. A neighbor of ours, who is an immaculate and uncompromising liberal, indignantly withdrew her dog from boarding there when she learned what the setup is. Even Russia abolished serfdom a century ago, she declared, and she is complaining to the proper authorities. Now it is likely that some liberals will say about one of these little case histories, or even all of them, in such circumstances a good liberal is not necessarily doctrinaire. He might quite possibly agree to an easier, more flexible attitude, letting well enough alone, and permitting people to work out such marginal cases as best they can. Some liberals will feel so, because they are humane, and because they see on reflection that in the real circumstances, the doctrinaire liberal solution to the problem is inhumane in its almost certain consequences. Nevertheless, as soon as those same liberals turn their eyes away from specific realities, as soon, that is, as they return to the world of their ideology, they will again declare for the prescribed solutions. And this will be proved by the spontaneity with which they join the criticism of some congressman, say, who wants to turn the clock back, and votes against minimum wage laws or attacks grandiose urban renewal projects. As for anyone who would say a kind word for serfdom in our day, the only thing for him is to have his head examined. For, the proposition that, for the first time in history we are in a position to provide all men with enough to eat, is so much a commonplace of current thinking that we are likely not to recognize its integral relation to liberal ideology. In an address to a World Food Congress, the late President John F. Kennedy gave it orthodox expression in these words.
We have the ability, we have the means, and we have the capacity to eliminate hunger from the face of the earth.
This belief was first formulated by the early socialists. It was a favorite subject for those whom Marx called the utopian socialists, Fourier, Saint-Simon, Robert Owen, as well as for Auguste Comte and the 19th century enthusiasts of science. It has been a stock in trade, also, of Marxism. In my own Trotskyite days in the 1930s I used to expatiate on it frequently in articles for the official paper or when carrying the word to the meager but earnest audiences that my comrades were able to round up for a lecture. To many persons today, liberals and non-liberals, it seems to be, indeed, a truism. It is just that seemingly self-evident certainty that should make us suspect that this proposition is empty of empirical, existential content, is merely an ideological cliché, an abstract deduction from ideological principles that has little if any relation to the real world of space and time. In order to delve further into the nature of ideological and therefore of liberal thinking, let me suggest a few considerations that lead to this conclusion. A. It would have made just as much sense, or as little, to have stated this proposition in many past ages as to state it today. True, the past ages did not have modern science and technology. But they also had only a tenth or a 20th as many people, and the people occupied much less of the earth's surface. They were capable of a much greater local self-sufficiency, if the inhabitants of the locality were prepared to work hard enough. In a bad season they might run out of food, and did. But Joseph showed how that difficulty could be solved by storing up the surpluses from good seasons. Food got low in winter. Naturally, if people preferred to guzzle when they had it in the summer, and didn't bother to preserve it by drying, salting, storing in caves or whatever. And as a matter of fact, a number of communities did have enough food most of the time. B. Most people who talk about our present potential for giving everyone enough food have not studied even the technical side of the problem. The fact is that there is not much good and used arable land remaining on Earth. From the small reserve, 100 million acres were added to agriculture in the years 1935 to 60, and of course people, houses, not to speak of roads, are using up the land surface at a tremendous rate. In the past 15 years the average per capita food consumption has been going down, not up. An increase of food sufficient to have some significance, even though at best it couldn't amount to very much on average, would have to come primarily from more intensive cultivation of land already being farmed in the large, heavily populated nations. This in turn would require as first premise an enormous increase in the use of artificial fertilizers. That is the way, along with very hard work, which is still more unusual, that Japan manages to keep all her population fed, though at a level much below what Americans would regard as a minimum. But Japan manufactures and uses much more fertilizer than all the rest of Asia combined, with Africa thrown in. How are those huge and multitudinous fertilizer plants going to appear in India, China, Pakistan? Fertilizer plants require a big electrical industry, a machine industry, adequate transport, trained technicians and workers. See, in affirming that we can now provide everyone with enough to eat, even the most optimistic of liberals are nowadays constrained to add the condition, if we can dampen the population explosion. It is certainly the case that many, and an increasing number of, human beings will continue to go hungry if the population does go on expanding at anything like the current rate. But it does not at all follow that everyone will be fed if only the rate drops. There are many other interfering facts, material, technical, psychological and cultural. These apart, What evidence is there to suggest that humanity in the world at large will oblige the food planners by the prescribed restraint in their breeding habits? In keeping with their doctrine, liberals explain the baby boom as due to ignorance, the mothers not knowing how to prevent conception, and poverty, the society not being technologically equipped to supply the contraceptive mechanisms or pills. The solution of the problem is therefore standard and simple. On the matter of having babies, the parents of the world will take the advice of the liberals and the mechanisms or pills supplied by the technologically advanced nations. And if, in spite of the advice and the available mechanisms, people just want to have a lot of babies? Or if the rulers of nations or churches or races want their subjects to go on having more babies than the subjects of the next nation, church or race, hunger or no hunger? About some things, human beings may not be quite so ignorant as liberals are compelled to assume in order to explain why the world fails so conspicuously to conform to the liberal recipes for the good society. The history of many tribes and nations proves that there are many ways by which parents have reduced the number of babies without benefit of modern technology. And the history of many others proves that the rational certainty of poverty and hunger is not always enough to make parents want to limit the size of their broods. One day, very much against advice received, my wife and I made our way to a remote sector of Calcutta where, in a large temple enclosure, the chief annual rite of the dread goddess Kali was being celebrated. The neighboring streets, like the enclosure itself, were filled with disorderly, noisy processions, deformed beggars, crowds dancing wildly around wailing musical instruments, hideous naked holy men and fakirs, stunted children and the miscellaneous poor. The air was reeking with smells, dominated by the oily smoke from the fleshy offerings that were being burned by scores of little groups of worshippers squatting in the open spaces inside the enclosure. To one side, about 50 feet from a corner of the main temple, which was surrounded by a covered porch, was a curious, many-branched tree. An endless line of wretched, half-starved women was moving around the tree and onto the temple porch. Each woman, as she passed the tree, hung a small piece of colored wool or cloth on one of the branches. By doing so, we learned, and by then completing the circumambulation of the temple, she would be granted more babies by Kali, who is goddess of fertility as well as of destruction. The proposition says that we are in a position to provide all men with enough to eat. Who is we? No single nation could do it. In fact, no outside combination could do it for the three great hungry nations, China, India and Pakistan. They would have to do it largely by and for themselves, and for the foreseeable future this is excluded on technical grounds even if all other conditions were realized. We is mankind. But mankind is not articulated into any sort of coherent entity that can do anything at all. Mankind has no mind nor any decision-making institution. It has no way of working together on a chosen project or toward a deliberate goal. Actually, this belief that we are now in a position to provide all men with enough to eat is an element of a purely abstract model. If all men would act rationally, and if they would make the getting of enough food for all their goal of highest priority, and if they would follow the advice of the best scientists and technicians in allocating resources and energy, etc., then there would be, or could be, enough to eat. But every one of these hypothetical premises is manifestly so contrary to fact as to be absurd. Of course men do not act rationally, generally speaking. They don't even consider food the matter of highest priority, whatever ideologues may imagine. India could quickly give a big boost to her food supply merely by getting rid of the sicker and uniformly useless 2/3 of her cows, eating them while doing so, and continuing to eat all the grain the cows now get and to farm the land their overcropping ruins, and for good measure shooting a few scores of millions of monkeys that gobble up fruit, grains and vegetables. But the Indians prefer honoring the divinity of the cows and monkeys to eating more food. I happen to mention the cows briefly, in connection with problems of economic development, in a lecture I gave some years ago in Bombay. The leading paper the next morning carried an across-the-page headline, "Burnham attacks our cows." Among the trams, cars and buses of Calcutta and Madras as well as in the smaller towns there are still to be seen cows wandering up to the food stalls to take their pick of delicacies, and starving workers will buy food not for themselves but to place on the public altars available to their bovine divinities. In Indian villages it is not at all uncommon to see a peasant, shrunk with hunger to little more than a skeleton, feeding stalks of grain to an abscessed, limping cow incapable of doing any work or giving an ounce of milk, the condition of most of them. Nor is it only cows that take priority over food. Indonesia had had enough food for centuries, before the Dutch as well as under them, until Sukarno took over. Now its people are barely getting fed with the help of massive international handouts. Sukarno's regime is more interested in arms, warships, monuments, glory and conquest than in food. Romania, Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and in many periods Russia itself, were all food surplus countries before communism moved in. But communism wants power more than food, and power dictates policies that conflict with those that might induce peasants to grow more food. Or take the famous White Highlands of Kenya that liberal publicists are fond of citing as an example of colonial and racist exploitation. The highlands are the part of Kenya that, by its temperature, rainfall and soil, make successful farming possible. They comprise in all about 45,000 square miles. Of these, 37,000 square miles are, as they have been in the past, farmed by African Negroes. The Europeans have been farming about 4,500 square miles, 1/10 of the lot, virtually all developed from scratch in the course of the past 60 years. From these 4,500 square miles the Europeans have been raising sufficient commercial crops to make up 80% in value of Kenya's export total of all goods and products, the factor on which Kenya's long-run economic development inevitably depends. But this is because the Europeans have the best land, the capital and so on. Ideology at once protests. The facts teach otherwise. Much of the highlands land, considerably more than the 4,500 square miles that were the European maximum, is at least as good, all of it is of the same basic character. Comparative studies have been made of African and European farming operations that are closely comparable in all respects, including available capital. They show that the European farmed land produces approximately 4 times as much per square mile as the African farmed land, approximately 4,300 pounds in annual value as against 1,100 pounds. It is certain that the economic condition of the highlands, and thus of Kenya as a whole, will continue in the next period the worsening that began several years ago, and that there will be less food for Kenya's inhabitants. As the Europeans continue to leave, their highly productive, technically advanced and efficiently managed farms are being broken up into subsistence plots or small uneconomic units, both types largely in the hands of incompetent Negroes. Very probably thousands of acres of the highlands will revert rather soon to the sterility in which the Europeans found them 60 years ago, cropped down to sour bare soil, perhaps, by cattle and horses kept to expand a tribe's prestige and status rather than its food supply. It may not be long before the rising young nation of Kenya is added to the list of those living by the surplus food of the citadel of world imperialism. There is no mystery here. It is simply that the native leaders of Kenya's African inhabitants want other things more than they want food. But if men don't even want food exceedingly, if they are willing to sacrifice food for the sake of power, glory, piety, laziness, resentments and large families, there is no practical point to insisting that in what can only be some purely abstract and theoretical sense.
We have the ability, we have the means, and we have the capacity to eliminate hunger from the face of the earth.
This proposition amounts in substance merely to the old familiar theorem that reappears in so many forms over the centuries: if men were angels, then the earth might be a little bit of heaven. Does it then follow that many human beings are destined to go hungry over the years to come? Yes, even so. But the liberal ideology, which, by clinging to an optimistic theory of human nature and history, by denying the objective reality of evil and affirming that all social problems can be solved, excludes genuine tragedy, cannot face this tragic fact. That is the real reason why the liberal repeats the proposition, derived not from fact but from doctrine, that we have the ability to provide all men with enough food. When the fact is tragic, his ideology offers him refuge from fact. 5. On January 13, 1963, Ralph McGill, an intransigent and orthodox liberal, commented in his syndicated column, behind the headlines, on what he described as a small item in the paper, 2 paragraphs long. He began by reproducing the item in its entirety.
Lima, Peru, 5 persons died early Wednesday in clashes between police and striking peasants at 2 sugar mills near Chiclayo, in northern Peru. The clashes occurred after strikers attacked and sought to burn down the Patapo and Pucula mills, inflicting heavy damage.
Mr. McGill continued with an excoriation of news reporting in our time, as illustrated by this item, because it only tells us what happens and not why something happens.
This did not give us a picture of what conditions are in Chiclayo in northern Peru.
He then fulfilled his liberal duty to enlighten us.
Drawing on our general knowledge of South American conditions, we can assume, with some confidence, that feudal conditions obtain in Chiclayo. We may be rather certain that low wages, long hours, and poor working conditions prevail. Agriculture in Latin America is almost everywhere depressed. Its workers live in poverty and wretchedness. Their political status is prejudiced. Illiteracy is the rule. Health conditions are primitive. The story is an old one. It is, however, no older than the familiar one of police versus strikers in an area where labor has no bargaining rights. The 2 paragraphs out of Chiclayo would, if amplified, help us to understand why President Kennedy's intelligent plan for assistance to Latin America is inoperative. It depends, for a beginning, on reform by landholders and industrialists in Latin America. Killing hungry and desperate men is hardly a reform.
Where in the world did all this stuffing come from, this confident description of Chiclayo's feudal conditions, low wages, long hours, absence of bargaining rights, etc.? There is nothing about all that in the news item. Mr. McGill did not get his data from observation. He has never been in Chiclayo nor anywhere in northern Peru nor, so far as I gather, anywhere else in Peru. He has never read anything about Chiclayo except, as he mentions in this column, a line or 2 in a book he looked up after reading the item, which told him, it is an agricultural coastal city of about 40,000 population. It is in a rice and sugar district. Sugar is the more important export. He did not consult anyone who had any first-hand knowledge either of Chiclayo in general or of the events reported to have transpired there. Mr. McGill's entire commentary was derived solely from ideology, untainted by even the most indirect touch of a single fact. This column appeared during the New York newspaper strike, and I happened to read it in the Waterbury Republican in the course of my search for substitutes for the fodder normally provided by the New York press. It was such a pure and classic example of ideological thinking that I decided to try to find out something more about Chiclayo and what had actually happened there, just for the fun of it. Undoubtedly it was not unlikely, from a statistical point of view, that what McGill had written was roughly accurate, discounting the emotive slop in which his prose is bathed, since it would hold for many, perhaps most, South American towns taken at random. Still I had somehow got curious about Chiclayo. The first thing I learned was that Chiclayo is the modern offshoot of a colony from Cuzco, capital of the Inca Empire, and the second, that McGill had apparently not even been first-hand in his ideological derivations. The New York Times, ideological fountainhead for right-thinking citizens, had picked up the report 2 days before and ideologized it into a ponderous editorial along exactly the same lines, Indian peasants expressing a protest, the specific motivation of which was less important than the general discontent. Now, for the first time, the people are learning that their poverty, illiteracy and disease are based on social injustice, etc. The Times' apodictic rhetoric had been mostly squandered on the desert air served by the Western and European editions, but possibly it had wafted its way onto McGill's desk. I next talked to a friend of mine who had lived in Peru, spent some while studying conditions there, and visited the scene of the episode. He informed me that this area, which has mines and some industry as well as agriculture, was one of the relatively more advanced parts of Peru, that the sugar mills were technically excellent, and their workers and those on the plantations supplying the mills relatively well paid, that they were mostly unionized and had many fringe benefits, such as medical care and help with housing, that are uncommon in South America. He said he had heard that communist agents, reinforced by operatives newly trained in Cuba, were active in the region and in the high mountains not far away, where the Indians were badly off. This evidence was confirmed by several other persons with first-hand knowledge, and with it McGill's ideological bubble shrank to droplet size. But I had not yet succeeded in getting direct knowledge about the particular incident mentioned in the news item, or, more exactly, the only direct report I had so far got was from a man with business interests in the area that might have prejudiced his account. I closed my own dossier on the McGill-Chiclayo case when I read the testimony that Edwin M. Martin, Assistant Secretary of State for Latin American Affairs, and thus in charge of President Kennedy's intelligent plan for assistance to Latin America, on which both McGill and the Times bestowed their blessing, gave on February 18, 1963 to the House Committee on Foreign Affairs.
In Peru, we have another dramatic example of the increasing tempo of communist-inspired subversion and violence. For the past several months, in an agricultural area of the Andean department of Cusco, communist agitators, many of whom were trained in Cuba, have been responsible for the forceful seizure of lands, armed attacks, and considerable bloodshed. Last December, Castro communist agitators subverted a strike at the smelter of the American-owned Cerro Corporation at La Arroya in the central Andes, seized control of the installation and caused about $4 million worth of damage. Early in January, following a strike that had been settled between the management and the legitimate trade union leaders, communist agitators persuaded workers on 2 Peruvian-owned sugar plantations near Chiclayo on the north coast to damage installations and fire cane fields, about $1 million of damage in all.
There is a test fairly simple in theory, though not always easy to carry out, that will show whether we are dealing with an ideology. Suppose we ask a man who believes so and so, what specific evidence, what observations, happenings, experiments, might conceivably prove you wrong? He is, let us say, an all-out anti-Semite. Will he admit, and stand by the admission, that if such and such happens, then that will prove his anti-Semitic beliefs to be wrong? Of course not. No matter what happens, he will regard it as either irrelevant or one more proof of his doctrine. If there is any seeming conflict between doctrine and reality, then reality, not the doctrine, must give way. This is exactly what proves that his system of belief is not a meaningful assertion about what is or is not the case in the real world, but an ideology, the primary function of which is not to state truths but to adjust attitudes. The rules for a meaningful assertion about the real world are entirely different. If I say that it is 75 feet from here to the driveway, my statement may in fact be 100% true, but it would be proved false, and everyone would recognize that it would be proved false, if we measured the distance with a tape or other suitable instrument and got as the result something other than 75 feet. If I say that at a given temperature the volume and pressure of a gas vary inversely, then there is no difficulty in conceiving how I might be proved wrong, though in fact I am right, namely, if I measure the two quantities and find that they do not vary inversely. But how will I ever prove to a strict classical economist that his laissez-faire equations do not always hold? No matter how many examples of apparent exception I point to, he will always explain that there has been an interference from monopoly or government or physical accident or trade union coercion. Whether or not all races are equal in civilizing potential, is there any conceivable evidence that could convince firm liberals that they are not equal, or Senator Ellender that they are? Again, obviously not. All conceivable evidence will be explained away in order to defend the chosen doctrine. It is a characteristic of ideological thinking, whatever the given ideology, that it cannot be refuted by logical analysis or empirical evidence. Actually, the internal logical structure of a developed ideology is usually quite good anyway, rather like the logical structure of paranoiac obsessions, which ideologies resemble in other ways also, and when a logical gap appears, as happened to liberalism in the doctrinal shift from limited to welfare state, sufficient ingenuity can always patch it up again, as we duly noted. The ideology is a way of interpreting the world, an attitude toward the world, and a method for dealing with the world. So long as I adhere faithfully to the ideology, there is no specific happening, no observation or experiment that can unmistakably contradict it. I can always adjust my categories and my attitude to allow for whatever it is that happens or that I observe. If necessary, I can shut my eyes. We all feel intuitively that a discussion or argument with my kind of people is very different from a discussion or argument in which some other kind takes part. The former is likely to seem more fruitful, as getting somewhere. The latter is often frustrating. Not only are those people of the other kind wrong, what they say is usually also irrelevant, and it is hard to see what point they are trying to make, even if they knew how to make it. My kind of people means, as the phrase is used, those who share my ideology, or my lack of ideology, if I am among the eccentric minority that has none. Mr. Hutchins mistakes the universe, in which his universal dialogue takes place. It is not the world of time and men and galaxies, but only a universe of discourse. The basic ideas, beliefs and values of his ideology constitute the frame, the setting, for the dialogue, and an argument or fact that juts outside that frame or departs from the setting becomes garbled and unintelligible. As the Washington School discussion syllabus explained,
in a democracy everyone has the right to his own convictions and attitudes toward others, but all attitudes and convictions must be based on truth and reason.
It is the ideology that defines what will be accepted as truth and reason. A discussion with a convinced ideologue on matters covered by his ideology is sure to be a waste of time, unless you share the ideology. What is there to discuss? His ideology is proof against the shock of any seemingly conflicting facts which you might bring forward. He will either reinterpret those facts so that they become consistent with his ideology, or deny them. There are no facts that could convince an intransigent John Burchite that there are no communists in the upper echelons of the American government. A debate between Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr. and William F. Buckley, Jr. can be a good show, and has been, but not a genuine discussion. Many liberals, especially among non-intellectuals, are not rigid, orthodox ideologues. Though they are adherents of the liberal ideology in a general, often largely unthinking way, there are gaps and flexible joints in their chitin. Between such loose liberals and those non-liberals who are not themselves unbreachably armored, communication, dialogue and discussion are possible. Of course even hardened ideologues are sometimes transformed, but not often by evidence or reasoned argument, usually by a deep shift in emotional allegiance, or the accumulated weight of direct experiences that the ideology proves unable to assimilate, or by fear or greed. As a rule, a man, when his ideological lenses are shattered, is in haste to replace them with another set ground to a new prescription. The unfiltered world is not his dish of tea.